Autism spectrum disorder, otherwise known as autism or ASD, is a developmental condition related to brain development and typically causes problems in communication, social understanding, and behavior. According to the CDC, quote, about 1 in 31, or 3.2% of children aged 8 years old, have been identified with ASD, end quote. ASD also encapsulates specific repeated patterns of behavior, which include a wide range of symptoms, or a spectrum of symptoms. This spectrum includes conditions that were once considered separate from autism, including Asperger's syndrome and childhood disintegrative disorder. ASD is a disorder that begins in early childhood. Children usually show symptoms of autism within the first year of their life, while others appear neurotypical at first, but develop symptoms between 18 and 24 months of age. With ASD emerging so quickly to affect children so early on in life, it becomes an issue for early childhood parents and mothers navigating their newborn's health, especially with the rising prevalence of ASD diagnoses worldwide. With this rise comes a growing awareness of socioeconomic pressures that families must face when caring for a newborn, and in some cases, a grown adult with autism. I was a part of one of these families. When my brother was born, my mom's brief window of relief after a long pregnancy quickly became clouded with more worry. The first few months after her pregnancy, everything seemed normal. It seemed to me that the last 9 stressful months had paid off, and that we were ready to give my brother a beautiful life. However, as months passed, small signs like poor eye contact, an expressionless face, and lack of response to his name led my mom to believe the worst, and her fears were shortly confirmed. My brother was diagnosed with ASD only a few months after he was born, and because his diagnosis came so early, we were not financially ready to prepare for the added tests and therapy sessions that came with it. We were not a well-off family, so every appointment became an extra burden for us, carrying not just stress but also emotional weight. And my family is not a one-off case. In fact, it grows increasingly more common every day. Socioeconomic status plays a larger role in the prevalence of ASD, and it continues to be underestimated. The following study, quote, Socioeconomic Status in Autism Spectrum Disorder, a case control study in Bangladesh, end quote, focuses on whether socioeconomic status, or SES, and sociodemographic factors, or SDFs, of parents affect the odds of a child having autism in Bangladesh. This study was mainly motivated by Bangladesh's limited ASD research and the need to broaden the country's scope of how SES patterns shine a light on the limited healthcare of the country. Overall, the study's findings show a strong correlation between SES and ASD, especially in a developing country context where income and education can dramatically shape a family's ability to support a child with autism. At the same time, the study highlights which factors do not meaningfully correlate with ASD, helping narrow down the most relevant predictors. Thus, this study shows the two-way relationship between ASD and SES, displaying that low-income families face barriers for diagnosis and support, and the cost of raising a child with ASD can further strain their SES. Recognizing this cycle is crucial for addressing how ASD disproportionately impacts families in poverty worldwide, which can increase health inequalities for children with autism. ASD is becoming increasingly more prevalent in communities around the world, with certain countries have reported an even more rapid growth. Bangladesh, one of the world's most densely populated countries, harbors a much lower ASD prevalence than higher-income countries like the US. However, many studies have shown a wide variety of ASD estimation rates, which suggests that many of the ASD cases in Bangladesh go unrecognized. The consensus of recent studies like the, quote, prevalence of autism spectrum disorder among children aged 18 to 36 months in a rural community of Bangladesh, a cross-sectional study, end quote, illustrates that 0.075% of children ages 18 to 36 months in Bangladesh are diagnosed with ASD. This may seem like a small number, especially compared to the US's 1 in 31 rate. But if it is being underreported, Bangladesh's inaccurate healthcare metrics can provide more insight into what specific socioeconomic subgroup of family is struggling the most. With a smaller sample size and a dense population, Bangladesh is the perfect state to display where ASD is being correlated with the most, and highlights where diagnostic disparities are most likely to occur. Bangladesh's healthcare system, where there is limited access to trained ASD clinicians, low public awareness of ASD symptoms, and an unequal spread of diagnosis centers, all contribute the unequal patterns of diagnosis and identification of ASD. Nonetheless, this imperfectness actually illuminates which families are most likely to receive support, which the study shows is typically families with low income, low education, and ones that live in rural areas. As stated previously, this study focused on wanting to figure out whether socioeconomic status of parents affect the chances of a child in Bangladesh having ASD. However, one point that is yet to be mentioned is that this study also incorporated the socio-demographic factors of parents into the equation. This addition garnered much more information about correlation than if the study had just focused on SES. Firstly, this study was a case-controlled study featuring 620 children in total. All of the children were ages 2 to 24 years of age. Half of these children were diagnosed with ASD, while the other half remained the undiagnosed control group. All the data was collected through face-to-face interviews from parents across 21 districts in Bangladesh. The main variable measured for SES was the monthly household income during pregnancy, which ranged from less than $10,000 to $10,000 to $20,000 to $20,000 to $30,000 and greater than $30,000, all measured in Bangladeshi taka, which is BDT for short. Other STFs measured were parents' education, parents' occupation, family type, the parent's age at birth, gender of the child, urban versus rural location, twin birth, and whether the child had a sibling with ASD or another neurodegenerative disorder. Obviously, many of these variables did not show any correlation, but they were measured nonetheless. The main finding was that families with a higher SCS had a lower chance of having a child with ASD. Families making less than $10,000 had a significantly higher chance of having a child with ASD than every other income group. 41.3% of families with children with ASD were likely to make less than $10,000 compared to the median of 20% for the other income groups. Thus, this is irrefutable evidence that families of lower income status have a higher chance of birthing children with ASD. Additionally, other SDFs that seem to have an impact were that of fathers with master's or higher degrees had significantly reduced odds of having a child with ASD, while the mother's education levels did not significantly affect ASD odds. Fathers aged 22 to 35 at childbirth had lower odds of having a child with autism than very young fathers, and nuclear families had a lower chance of birthing children with ASD. However, the strongest predictor, besides a family's SES, was the gender of the child. Male children had more than double the odds of ASD compared to female children. The results of this study support the point that there is a clear two-way relationship between socioeconomic status and autism in Bangladesh. Not only does a low SES increase the likelihood that a child will develop ASD, but having to raise a child with ASD can also deepen a family's financial burdens. Addressing the first half of the relationship, low socioeconomic status significantly increases the odds of a child having ASD, most likely due to exposure to higher health risks, especially during the prenatal phase of pregnancy. Data from Autism Speaks suggests that, quote, prenatal exposure to the chemicals thalidomide and valproic acid has been linked to increased risk of autism, end quote. Studies have yet to definitively confirm this link, but regardless, higher exposure to air pollution, environmental toxins, and crowded or unsafe living conditions, which are all more common in low-income communities, are each known to contribute to adverse developmental outcomes, ASD or not. Families with low incomes can also have reduced prenatal care, fewer pregnancy screenings, and less overall nutrition, which can all affect the development of a child. Therefore, in this case, the effect of poverty is directly tied to the health outcomes of children. For the latter half of the relationship, having a child with ASD can deepen a family's financial strain. In Bangladesh, healthcare and special services for children with ASD are already limited, so access to things like educational support systems become a huge financial burden if attainable at all for these families. As a result, these parents may have to reduce their work hours to care for their child. This does not reinforce a good socioeconomic status for these families and increase their level of poverty due to forces out of their control. Finally, the data found regarding fathers' education, fathers' age, and family structure also points back to broader social patterns. Higher education and a stable family can mean stronger social networks, increased health education, and other variables that can better inform a family undergoing a pregnancy to prevent conditions like ASD. Between SES and these SDFs, it is obvious that the two-way relationship found with ASD and SES in Bangladesh incorporates social, economic, environmental, and structural aspects which all relate back to the overall questions of poverty. So why does it matter? When it comes to respecting the dignity and autonomy of every human being, no one is burdened more than families or even single parents with the burden of taking care of a child, or in most cases, multiple children. Adding a cognitive or developmental disability to that responsibility can turn an already demanding burden into an insurmountable one for many of these families. But if so many families around the world already have a significant burden to provide aid for their kids, why should families with children diagnosed with ASD garner any more support than others who may have double the number of kids to look out for? The answer is clear. The individuals burdened the most in this situation are the kids diagnosed with ASD, who will develop increased health inequalities, especially those in families of low socioeconomic status. As the data suggests, ASD and SES display a two-way relationship. Low socioeconomic status can make diagnosis, treatment, and early therapy less accessible. And all these same variables can continue to push a family with a child with ASD further into financial strain. Therefore, understanding and addressing the issue is not just about recognizing that yes, there is a correlation between ASD and SES, but it is using this knowledge to approach issues related to healthy development, equitable care, and social inclusion. Recognizing this data is the first step in offering further support for these families, investing in actual human dignity. The reason why families with children with ASD are largely overshadowed, especially in countries like Bangladesh, is because of the sheer number of regular families who are struggling. This does not mean that families dealing with ASD should go unnoticed. To respect the dignity of everyone is to respect that families dealing with ASD suffer just the same, if not more, than other families raising newborn children. This study does a good job of highlighting the correlation between ASD and SES in Bangladesh. But how do we know that this is an accurate representation of the relationship between the two worldwide and in higher income countries? What is stopping one from saying that families in countries with higher incomes have better support structures like better healthcare and access to therapy? It seems that from this perspective, the ASD and SES correlation is only tied together in countries like Bangladesh, where there are more healthcare barriers for low-income families. However, these facts still do not break the argument. Firstly, the study focused on all the factors that correlated with the odds of a child being diagnosed with ASD, not the total number of cases reported. In other words, even if richer countries can diagnose ASD more effectively, it does not erase the data found from the 620-person sample size of the experiment. Secondly, research from higher income countries like the US also reports that low-income families in these countries have higher exposure to prenatal air pollution. Secondly, research from higher income countries like the US also reports that low-income families in these countries have higher exposure to prenatal air pollution, have less access to prenatal care, and experience more prenatal malnourishment. Quote, children of lower socioeconomic status are more likely to be exposed to both indoor and outdoor air pollution, end quote. Lastly, simply having better support structures in higher income countries does not erase the environmental, biological, and social determinants of health that increase risk in the first place. Higher income countries do not entirely refute the evidence of correlation in this study, as the data serves to highlight the structural inequality that can affect developmental health. The core relationship between ASD and SES remains consistent across most countries worldwide and should be a wake-up call to view how families dealing with an ASD diagnosis are struggling compared to others. Speaking of higher income countries, the US is a perfect example of how these socioeconomic inequalities surrounding ASD can still be found in society. The study, Socioeconomic Inequality in the Prevalence of Autism Spectrum Disorder, evidence from a US cross-sectional study, shows data that, quote, SES gradient was significantly stronger in children with pre-existing diagnosis than in those meeting criteria for ASD, but with no previous record of an ASD diagnosis, end quote. In other words, lower SES families in the US still often experience underdiagnosis, delayed diagnoses, or misdiagnoses. This occurs even though environmental risks are higher for them. Returning to the impact of environmental injustice on children's health, Matthew Rasson suggests that, quote, children in lower socioeconomic households experience significantly higher exposure to both indoor and outdoor air pollution, which is associated with increased ASD risk, end quote. Despite being in a high-income earning country, the disparity continues to exist. This disparity crosses over into the financial burden of US families as well. Yes, being considered, quote, lower income in America still means you are a higher earner than most people in the world, but the direct and indirect costs of supporting a child with ASD can still lead to socioeconomic strain. A study using data from the National Health Interview Survey estimates that, quote, ASD was associated with a $3,020 higher health care cost and a $14,000 higher aggregate non-health care cost. Thus, ASD is still correlated with SES even in higher income states. Recognizing that ASD and socioeconomic status have a two-way relationship and are not just a cause and effect dynamic should be the biggest takeaway from the data included in this study. Nevertheless, it is not just recognizing the existence of this relationship that will help families in these situations involving ASD, but this knowledge should be used as a practical guide for the next steps to address this issue. I was motivated to research this topic because of how personal it felt to me. When my brother was diagnosed with ASD, my mom had to quit her job so she could take him to therapy, doctor's appointments, and constant evaluations. My family was already not in the financial position to support this, and losing another source of income pushed us into a financially risky position. What happened to us continues to happen to families supporting kids with ASD around the world, especially in low-income communities. This Bangladesh study shines a light on the fact that when a child receives an ASD diagnosis, the burden often falls hardest on the people with the fewest resources, people who are already struggling. Because of this fact, it is imperative that recommendations to solve this issue address both sides of the problem. Firstly, families need greater access to early screening, prenatal care, and public health education, especially in low-income or rural communities. This would allow more families to be able to recognize developmental issues in their children earlier on, gaining more time to prepare for the commitment that is to come. Secondly, governments should work towards building healthcare systems that have better support systems that disregard socioeconomic inequalities. This could come in the form of in-kind programs or tax credit programs specifically targeted to families with children with developmental disabilities. These kinds of programs would have the greatest effect in helping the affordability of providing children with ASD and equitable education in childhood to other children their age. Lastly, simply continuing to raise awareness for this two-way relationship and its effects on families dealing with supporting their children is the best way to encourage change. Families should not have to navigate ASD alone, and they should not be forced into poverty because they want to give their child a dignified life. Everything comes back to giving these children a life that respects their dignity and autonomy as human beings, and hopefully spreading the word of these facts around regarding the relationship between ASD and SES leads the world closer to finding a solution to address issues of inequality like this one.